Okay, picture this. You're in Vietnam, and Typhoon Yagi just slams into the country.
Oh, wow.
It's like the strongest super typhoon in 70 years.
Oh my gosh.
Hundreds of lives are lost, billions of dollars in economic losses.
Wow.
And yet, in the middle of all this devastation, something like amazing happens. People come together
Uh-huh.
and they donate to help those affected, and ends up being over 1.6 trillion Vietnamese dong.
Wow. That's incredible.
Which, if you do the conversion, it's almost 67 million US dollars.
That's
It
amazing.
really makes you think, right? Like
Yeah,
how generous people can be, especially during a crisis.
it really is. It's such a powerful example of human resilience and compassion.
Exactly. And, it actually made me think of a question based on some of the research that you sent over,
Okay, good.
and really kind of got me thinking, does gender play a role in how people respond to these kinds of crises?
Yeah.
Do men and women differ in their generosity?
Mm.
And what do people think about that? Like, what's the general perception?
Yeah.
So we're going to actually explore this today through a study that was done in Vietnam in 2022
Okay.
while the country was dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Got it.
So it's called Gender and Generosity: How Contribution Information Triggers Solidarity Behavior During a Crisis.
Okay.
And they use a really cool method in this study. They weren't just looking at, like, how much people actually donated.
Yeah.
They were also looking at their perceptions.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, what they believed other people would give.
Interesting.
So that's really interesting because it allows you to kind of, like, get at the nuances of generosity.
Yeah.
To see the gap between what we think will happen
Right.
and what actually happens.
Exactly. And it gives us a much more in-depth understanding of that disconnect, which is often really key when we're trying to understand social behavior.
Absolutely. So what did they find? Like, were people good at predicting how others would behave?
Well, not really. On average, the participants in this study predicted that others would donate around 55,000 Vietnamese dong,
Okay.
but the actual average donation was closer to 41,000.
So people were overestimating generosity.
They were, yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, there are probably a bunch of different factors at play, but one explanation could be what's called self-serving bias.
Okay.
Basically, we tend to see ourselves in a good light,
Yeah.
and that includes seeing ourselves as being, pretty generous.
Uh,
So we may unconsciously inflate our estimates of what others will give,
Interesting.
because deep down we think that we would be among those who are the most generous givers.
Oh, that's interesting. It's like we're projecting our own, like, idealized self-image onto other people.
Exactly, yeah. It's like, well, I'm a good person, so surely everyone else must be too, right?
Yeah.
But then there's also the element of social desirability. Like, we all know that being helpful and generous is seen as a good thing. It's something that's valued in society.
Right.
So we may, like, unconsciously adjust our perceptions to align with that. It's not necessarily that we're consciously trying to, like, mislead anyone, but it's kind of this subtle way of trying to fit in with social expectations.
I get it. Okay, so now let's get to the core of this deep dive, which is the gender aspect.
Yeah.
Did this study find any differences in how men and women responded to, like, this opportunity to donate?
Absolutely. And what's really cool is that when they asked people what they thought would happen, before they saw any data,
Okay.
most participants assumed men and women would contribute equally.
Yeah. Which seems like a pretty, like, reasonable assumption.
Yeah, totally.
On the surface, but yeah.
But the actual data paints a very different picture. So women, on average, donated way more than men, like around 43,000 Vietnamese dong compared to 37,000. And what's even more intriguing is that this difference was also reflected in what people predicted.
Oh, really?
So even though people said they thought men and women would give the same amount,
Yeah.
they actually kind of guessed that women would be more generous.
So it's almost like they were aware of this potential difference on some level,
Yeah,
even if they weren't fully conscious of it.
yeah. And that's what makes it so interesting to think about. Like, do we have these deeply ingrained societal assumptions about gender roles?
Uh-huh.
Even if we don't realize it, are they influencing our actions and our perceptions?
That makes you wonder.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely raises a lot of questions about the complexity of human behavior. Like, we might believe in certain things, consciously.
Uh,
We might say, okay, men and women are equal, but our actions and even the things we predict might tell a completely different story.
It's like there's this disconnect between what we think we believe and how we actually behave.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what makes it so fascinating to study and to try to understand.
Yeah, it really is fascinating, like how these subtle biases can like shape the way we see the world.
Right.
And it makes me think, about the context of this study.
Uh-huh.
So we're talking about Vietnam during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
And I think we all know that crises can bring out like the best in people, but they can also kind of make like existing inequalities even worse.
Absolutely.
So I'm wondering if maybe those factors played a role in the findings.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's really important to to think about the cultural context here.
Yeah.
Vietnam has this really strong tradition of collective action, right?
Uh-huh.
Community support, especially when times are tough.
Right.
They have this helping hand mentality that's just kind of baked into the culture.
So even with like a global pandemic happening, there was still this underlying feeling of like we're all in this together.
Yeah,
And we
exactly.
gotta support each other.
Yeah, and that cultural backdrop could have definitely influenced people's perceptions and their actions.
Yeah.
You can imagine, right?
Yeah.
That the combination of those values and
Yeah.
then the urgency of the crisis, it's possible that it just kind of amplified those existing societal expectations
Right.
of women, as caregivers and nurturers,
Yeah.
which maybe then led to higher levels of giving.
Makes sense. It shows like how complex it all is, right?
Yeah.
How cultural norms and like what's going on around you kind of just kind of intertwine.
Totally.
Okay, so the researchers didn't stop at just like observing those differences.
Right.
They wanted to actually see if they could like change people's behavior
Oh,
by
interesting.
making them aware of those patterns.
Okay, so how'd they do that?
They introduced something called contribution information to one group of the participants.
Oh.
And basically, they just told them about a previous study that has shown that women tend to be more cooperative than men.
Oh, so they were basically like, hey, just so you know, women are statistically more likely to be generous.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
So did that like change anything?
So you would think, right,
Yeah.
that if you tell men that, they might be more motivated to give.
Yeah, to kind of close that gap.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But surprisingly, it didn't really change anything.
Really?
Yeah. So the contribution information, it did increase people's perceptions of generosity.
Okay.
So they guessed that others would give more,
Uh-huh.
but it didn't actually change how much they themselves donated.
That's so interesting. It's kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah, totally. And what I think it shows is that just knowing about social norms
Yeah.
isn't always enough to change behavior.
Yeah.
Our actions are influenced by so many things, right?
Uh-huh.
Personal values, our emotions, what's happening around
That
us.
situation, yeah.
Exactly. And in this case, those other factors might have just overridden whatever influence that contribution information could have had.
It's like that old saying, knowledge is power, but only if you actually use it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You can know something, but it doesn't mean you're going to change what you do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it also highlights the limitations of just, giving people information and expecting them to change.
Right.
It suggests that maybe we need more nuanced approaches,
Right.
ones that really tap into people's deeper motivations
Uh-huh.
and actually address the root causes of why they behave the way they do.
Right. So if just like knowing about those gender differences in giving doesn't really change things, what does this study tell us about like generosity in general?
Right.
What are like the key takeaways for our listeners here?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that generosity is complicated.
Okay.
It's not just about how much money we give. It's also about what we believe about other people, what our motivations are, and the circumstances surrounding it.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that it's not just a simple act of giving, right?
Yeah.
It's influenced by all these different things.
Right.
Like our individual values, social norms, cultural values, and even like really subtle things like the gender of the giver
Totally.
or the nature of the crisis itself.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that complexity makes it all the more important that we try to understand it better,
Right.
If we can figure out what actually motivates people to give, then we can create better strategies to encourage it,
Yeah.
especially when it's really needed.
Especially during those crises.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
even though that contribution information didn't actually increase donations directly,
Right.
it did have an interesting effect on something called Solidarity perception.
Oh, yeah.
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so solidarity perception is basically how people view the level of support and cooperation within their community.
Okay.
It's like, do you feel like people have your back? Do you
Mm.
feel like everyone's in this together? Like
Oh,
there's that we're all in this together spirit.
yeah.
And what they found in this study is that even though telling people about like those gender differences in giving didn't change how much they donated themselves,
Ah,
it did make them more likely to believe that others would be generous.
interesting. So even if it didn't change their actions, it shifted their perception of like the community's overall generosity.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like they were saying, okay, well, maybe I'm not going to donate more, but I know other people are out there being generous.
Right, right.
And that perception, that feeling of solidarity, it can be really powerful.
Especially in those tough times.
Totally. Yeah. It can like build trust, make people feel closer to each other, and just create a stronger, more resilient community overall.
I like that. So while this particular study focused on like financial donations during the COVID-19 pandemic in Vietnam, it feels like the insights like have broader implications.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
It reminds us that generosity is this like multifaceted thing,
Uh-huh.
that it's not just about writing a check.
It's about so much more than that.
Yeah, it's about understanding all those different factors that like play into it.
Right.
Individual motivations,
Uh-huh.
social norms, cultural values.
Yeah.
And then just like being aware that even those tiny little cues can influence how we perceive things
Right.
and how we behave.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it's about like appreciating the power of that feeling of solidarity,
Yeah.
that collective action, especially when things are tough.
Yeah, it really makes you think about all those people who like donated after Typhoon Yagi, like we talked about at the beginning.
Right.
And it's so inspiring to imagine like all those acts of giving, big and small, adding up to that incredible, almost 67 million US dollars.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really emphasizes the fact that generosity isn't just about money.
Right.
Like, think about all the people who volunteered their time, their skills
Yeah.
after that typhoon hit.
Yeah.
People clearing debris, offering medical aid,
Right.
just being there for people who lost everything.
Right.
Like, that kind of support, that's priceless.
It is. It really shows how generosity can take so many different forms.
Totally.
And sometimes the most meaningful contributions, they're not even financial at all, right?
Right.
It's about just like being there for your community,
Uh-huh.
offering your time, your skills, whatever you can do to help.
Exactly. And those acts of generosity, like they often require a different kind of sacrifice.
Okay.
It's about putting your own needs aside and putting others first.
Uh-huh.
And that takes a lot of empathy and a real commitment to like the greater good.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of brings it back to our listeners.
Yeah.
How do you define generosity?
Right.
How do you show up for your community, your loved ones, even strangers who need help?
Yeah.
Like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, it could be anything, right?
Yeah.
Volunteering at a soup kitchen,
Right?
donating to a cause you care about,
Mm.
or just, listening to a friend who's going through a hard time.
Yeah, those are all such like powerful acts of generosity.
Totally. And I think what it really comes down to is that generosity is like this fundamental expression of what makes us human.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that other people have needs and responding with kindness and action.
Mm.
And that can look different for everyone. It doesn't have to be some big grand gesture.
Right.
It's about finding those small but meaningful ways to make a positive impact on the world around you.
Absolutely. And I think that's a perfect note to end on, actually.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on gender and generosity, let's keep these insights in mind as we go about our lives.
Uh-huh.
Let's be more aware of how our perceptions and actions are shaped.
Mm-hmm.
And let's just keep exploring all those different ways that we can contribute
Right.
to a more compassionate, more resilient world.
Beautifully said. I think, as we move forward, it's important to remember that generosity is a journey.
Huh.
It's not a destination.
Yeah.
It's about like constantly cultivating empathy, practicing kindness,
Right.
and just finding those ways, big or small,
Yeah.
to make a difference in other people's lives.
I love that. And that's it for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those generosity superpowers activated.